Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Can you confirm you can hear me, Diego or Lars?
Hey, Samir.
Wonderful. So, colleagues, welcome to the Disability Inclusion Common Service webinar as part of the series of the High Impact Common Services, as we have been having the webinars in the past few days. Today we have our focus on disability and inclusion, and in particular what operational services can basically further improve disability inclusion in the UN Common System. In this webinar today, we have our colleagues or experts in the area of disability inclusion. We have Gopal Mitra, our social and Disability and Inclusion Advisor from the Office of the Secretary General, and a team of experts on disability inclusion, as well as the DCO team led by Lars Susheisen, the Chief of the Country Business Strategy branch. Apologies, it's early morning in New York before the first coffee. So let me hand over quickly to Lars to take you through a very quick recap, and then we'll proceed with Gopal, who will be speaking about the disability inclusion strategy of the UN, and then we'll proceed with specific common services on disability inclusion in the BOS. Over to you, Lars.
Thank you, Samir, and good morning, colleagues from New York. This is the second webinar in a series of webinars we're organizing. I'm going to give you a bit of a very quickly a background, because most of you probably were in the webinar on gender responsive procurement yesterday already, or in the humanitarian booking hub. But for those of you who were not there, before Gopal goes into the details, these are a series of webinars. So now that the BOSs are moving into place and most countries have completed their BOS, we're shifting gears towards highlighting more individual services that countries can use. Most of these services have a demonstrated effect in either cost reductions or qualities or in social impact. So as you can see on this slide, we have disability. Can you go back one slide, Diego, please? For example, disability services has a very high social impact. That's renewable energy that's coming up. The gender sensitive procurement was yesterday. Humanitarian booking hub. This is a rolling webinar series, so you see more services being added here. We're working on a fleet management and mobility webinar. What we present here are services that have proven merit. We capture these services in standardized packages, so it's easier for you to literally take them off the shelf and localize them, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch. It's better for quality. It's cheaper way of designing services, and you'll often hear other specialists speak to the solutions. So, for example, humanitarian booking hub was WFP, gender responsive procurement was UN Women, but they designed these services jointly with DCO to scale them through the BOS. So without further ado, I want to introduce Gopal Mitra from USG, who is one of the specialists leading the disability work. So Gopal, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lars. Thank you, Samir, and thank you so much to DCO for organizing this webinar. Colleagues, and thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will take about 5 or 6 minutes to give you a flavor of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. And now the strategy, which we call the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, or colleagues also called it UNDIS, the acronym in short, was launched by the Secretary General in June 2019. So it's less than 2 years old, like you can say a new kid on the block. It was launched specifically to bring about lasting and transformative change on disability inclusion in the work of the UN. Now, colleagues, many of you will know that a significant amount of the population consist or comprise persons with disabilities. Research shows that 15% of the population, of any population, have one disability or another. and that amounts to more than 1 billion people in this world. So it's a significant part of the population. The numbers are big, and we realized along the way that the UN can and should do more on to strengthen, to enhance, or to advance on the inclusion of persons with disabilities. And the strategy was launched with that aim and in that spirit, to accelerate change and also how to track and measure change. Now, the strategy, the UN Disability Strategy, or UNDIS, consists of a policy and an accountability framework. The policy lays out the overall vision and commitment of the UN system on disability inclusion, and the accountability framework of the strategy. It consists of indicators with specific benchmarks. There are two elements which are interlinked, which form the accountability framework of the strategy. The first element or component is the UN entity accountability framework, and the second component is the UN country team scorecard on disability inclusion. They are interlinked, and as I said, they consist of specific indicators with benchmarks, which we'll discuss a little later. Now, I should say that and this is why this webinar is so relevant, the strategy cuts across all the three pillars of the UN's work: development, human rights, peace and security, as well as it covers both programs and operations. And the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy is also aligned with other corporate strategies or priorities, namely the gender swap, the youth strategy, the strategy on indigenous persons, which is in the making and it's about to be finalized. Now, let me give you a little flavor of what the strategy or the accountability framework, the UNCT scorecard that I said, the second part of the component of the accountability framework, which is relevant for today's discussion. What does it consist of? As I said, the UNCT scorecard, which you call it in short, consists of specific indicators with benchmarks in several areas. Now, there are 4 core areas, and there are a total of 14 indicators in the UNCT scorecard. These indicators cover several areas which are key to advancing disability inclusion. Now, as I said, they are divided in 4 core areas. The first core area is leadership, strategic planning, and management. Under this core area, there are indicators on leadership, whether the UNCT leadership is championing disability inclusion. There are indicators on the common country analysis, the cooperation framework, coordination, and so on, and with benchmarks on how it should fulfill, or what levels it should fulfill to foster disability inclusion. The second core area is inclusiveness. And under this core area, there are indicators which are also very significant for operations and for today's webinar. There are indicators on consulting organizations of persons with disabilities, on accessibility, on procurement, and so on. The third core area is programming. And under this core area, there are specific indicators on joint initiatives, on disability data, on monitoring and evaluation, on humanitarian action, and so on. And the last core area is organizational culture. As you will know, colleagues, it's very important to advance disability inclusion. And under this core area, there are indicators on employment of persons with disabilities, on capacity building of the UN system or the UNCT on disability inclusion, and on communications, how disability inclusive are our communications. So this is how the scorecard, this is what the indicators in the scorecard are about. And just the next slide. And as I told you before, for each indicator, there are benchmarks. Now, the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy is modeled on the Gender System-Wide Action Plan. And for each of these indicators, there are different levels of achievement. It's based on a 5-point grading scale. So for each indicator, as I told you, there is an indicator on accessibility, or there is an indicator on leadership. For each indicator, there are benchmarks to approach requirement. There are little more stringent benchmarks on meeting requirement of that indicator, and even more stringent benchmarks on exceeding the requirement. So it recognizing that UNCTs are at different points on disability inclusion, and it's a journey. So the indicators are framed in this manner. And if for example, a UNCT does not approach requirements for that indicator, it will miss the requirements, and in some instances, an indicator may not be applicable for a particular UNCT. So in that case, it will be not applicable. And this is how all the indicators that I spoke about a little while back, this is how they are structured. Now, in terms of the UNCTs have started implementing the strategy, and the reporting on the strategy is annual, and it has been incorporated within the SDG Information Management System, the IMS. And there are also technical notes which further elaborate on each of these indicators, on what these indicators actually mean. And there are also a reporting template and a host of other resources which are available on the UNSDG portal to be used. I will end there and hand it over back to Zamir, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gopal, and thank you, colleagues, for being with us. Just to recap, colleagues, that we have the team in the background, experts on this. Gopal Mitra is there. We have Georgia, Brianna, and Amy. All these colleagues are experts or supporting the UNDIS implementation at in the UN system-wide. So please feel free to share your questions in the chat box. We'll either come back to those questions in our FAQ section at the end, or we'll send out some of the responses in written form in the chat, and then follow up to the webinar. So coming now specifically to the disability inclusion common services for the BOS, colleagues, related to what Gopal just explained in terms of the bigger picture and the areas that are covered in the scorecard of the UNCT, when it comes specifically to the business operation strategy, the disability inclusion common services are focused on 3 areas: the areas of physical accessibility of the UN premises, digital web accessibility of our websites and platforms, and then inclusiveness of our human services, human resource services and processes. So I'll take you through a very quick introduction of these 3 areas. If you go to the next slide, please. So the very first common service that has been introduced and is very relevant to the disability inclusion strategy is the physical accessibility of the UN premises. And physical accessibility of the UN premises has been basically divided into 3 categories or 3 levels that you can start at your country level. And you need to ensure that your offices are accessible either at level 1, level 2, or level 3. And that comes in the next slide to show you what exactly these requirements are for level 1, level 2, level 3, just to help you prioritize better your engagement and your efforts to making your offices accessible. So basically, the minimum requirements for a level 1 accessibility in an office, in a UN office, is that we have an accessible entrance, we have accessible evacuation routes or access. There's at least 1 parking space, there is at least 1 accessible meeting room, accessible restrooms, accessible workstation, and if possible, there is like accessibility around the common area of the office. So depending on the ability of the UNCTs and OMTs on how can they implement the physical accessibility levels in their offices, you don't have to start only from the level 1 if you're able to even move on to level 3, or if you are in the level 3. The very first approach that you will take, you will be looking into the guidance notes or practice notes that will be shared for these common services, and map and identify what stage you are in your particular country or in your particular agency. And then depending on the availability of resources and a possibility of necessary alterations in the premises, you can either go for level 1, 2, or 3. Ideally, we want to see that in a cycle of BOS in the next, let's say, couple of years, all of our offices reach the level 3 accessibility level in terms of like physical accessibility of the offices. The next slide, colleagues, focuses on digital and web accessibility of the UN platforms. We know that a number of our websites are now accessible, and there is also a number of websites and platforms that still doesn't have the necessary requirements to meet the minimum requirements of accessibility. And we also know that some of our websites, particularly the agency websites, are managed at the corporate level. So at the corporate level, we are engaging with the Office of the Information Technology of various agencies to work towards making our websites and corporately managed platforms accessible to persons with disabilities as well. However, for the platforms or for the websites that are developed at the country level, those that are managed at the country level, our recommendation is that colleagues in the operations management team, obviously the ICT working groups, would look into all the platforms and websites that are developed and managed at the country level, identify the accessibility gaps in those websites, and then plan towards addressing those accessibility gaps in the process of implementation of their BOS. This again should become like a common service for all of the agencies to collaborate, so that we can ensure that at certain stage or countries, locally managed websites and online platforms are fully accessible to persons with disabilities. And if there are like requirements for equipment and tools to make your digital infrastructure accessible, those will need to be included as part of your collaboration on these services as well. The next slide, colleagues, focuses on the very important common service, the inclusiveness of HR common services. And here, our focus as part of the inclusive HR is on the disability inclusion. We know that as part of inclusive HR, you have been working on various other aspects as well, such as the gender parity and all. But in here, our focus is that our operations management teams should collaborate on making the mainly as a first step the engagement, the sourcing, and the recruitment process accessible, and make the local basically recruitment process much more possible for persons with disability to at least join the process, have the fair share of competition within the local UN market, and be recruited in the UN system. So under the inclusive HR common services in the BOS platform, we have identified a number of common services in priority that you can look into. Some of them could also go in parallel. The very first common service is to, again, like this applies across the board to all the three service categories, to map disability inclusion in the human resource practices at the country level, basically to see if you have persons with disabilities in the UN system, do they have the required reasonable accommodation that they need in order to perform their work, and do you have basically access to the network of organizations of persons with disabilities, and is there any engagement? Are there ways where the UN system are basically approaching or sourcing talent from this great group of our society? So mapping of disability inclusion in the HR practices is one of the key areas or one of the key common services that you will need to start with. Then the other common service areas that are introduced and are now available in the BOS online platform is to map and engage with organizations of persons with disabilities, and this is important, colleague. You will see in the disability inclusion practice notes the definition of these organizations and basically their role to engage persons with disabilities and have like a network of persons with disabilities at the local level, so that when you advertise a position or when you make a vacancy available, you could share it with these organizations, and they could help you in further sourcing talents as you would do from all the other channels, but in here you're targeting persons with disabilities. So the other activity that has been added, or other common service that has been added in the BOS online platform, is career fairs or job fairs, very, very targeted and specific to persons with disabilities, so that you can work with the organizations of persons with disabilities and organize a countrywide or citywide, depending on the context of the country, a career fair where you would be basically explaining, as you would do for all the other colleagues or all the other prospect applicants, but in here in a targeted manner, explain the UN recruitment process to persons with disabilities, and also maybe train them where necessary or orient them where necessary on how the UN job application process and recruitment process is. And in this process, we also need to look into how can we simplify without going into major adjustments into our policies and procedures and engagements and at the corporate level, but how can we at the local level create accommodations during our recruitment process, so persons with disabilities could have much more ability as well as much more fair chance to compete. Maybe there might be needs for adjustment of the interview process or adjustment in the written test process, but at least the colleagues will have a better idea that there is a job market in the UN. They are being treated the same way as any other applicants, and if necessary, there could be basically flexibilities to accommodate their needs so that they can compete in this process as well. Other common service added in the human resources group or category, colleagues, is the training for staff, and this training for staff is like your staff, your existing staff in the office, as part of an orientation to all staff on the disability inclusion policy, as well as on an awareness and ensuring that our colleagues at the country level are mindful of the required accommodations or flexibilities that they will need to practice in their day-to-day work to support persons with disabilities in their working environment. So that training for the staff is another common service and is highly recommended. The other services included are hiring and onboarding of persons with disabilities. So we're not saying that we have to give a specific preference to one group of society, but we want to ensure that we give a fair chance for all groups in our society to compete in the UN process, and if they are found the most suitable candidate, they are recruited and they are onboarded in the process. So the process of onboarding for persons with disabilities might require slight adjustments depending on the type of the disability that the colleague or the prospective applicant might have. So required adjustments will need to be introduced at the country level to accommodate onboarding of the persons with disability as well. The other most important aspect or most important common service as part of the inclusive HR is that yes, you will be going through mapping of the disability and inclusion. You'll train your staff. You'll have career fairs where you will be basically attracting persons with disabilities to apply and engage in the UN system. But once they are on board, you need to ensure that they have the reasonable accommodation to be able to work. And this goes hand in hand with your accessibility of web and digital services, and as well as with the physical accessibility of your offices. So you need to run these projects somehow in parallel, or start and end them in parallel, so that by the time you have a colleague or a staff engaged in the organization who has a particular disability, you could provide, your office would be able to provide the reasonable accommodation for that. And the reasonable accommodation is ensuring that they either have the right type of furniture or desk or equipment or IT tools, so that the colleague could function as efficient as any of us in the office. So these are basically in nutshell the common services that are introduced in the BOS Online platform as part of disability and inclusion, and to support the implementation of the UNDIS. Next slide, please. Okay. So, colleagues, the way forward for those of you that has been in our webinars, I think it's now very obvious. So, in the next slide, you will be basically guided that all these services that we have been introducing as part of the high impact services, and in particular today, the services indicated in the disability inclusion common services, the approach should be taken as a collaborative approach with all agencies. So all agencies are encouraged to join this common service. You need to map your accessibility requirements UN-wide at the country level as part of your operations management team work plan, depending on how many premises do you have, or depending on how many platforms all UN agencies have, and you need to plan to ensure that the accessibility gaps are mapped there. And then the plans are in place to implement different levels of accessibility in terms of physical or digital, as well as the inclusiveness of the HR. So this has to become a common collaborative service in your BOS, and to be implemented at the country level. As I have been mentioning all the time, there is an expert group sitting at the background for all of the high impact common services. So in particular, for the disability inclusion, we have a wonderful team of experts willing to support countries in implementation of the UNDIS strategy on all areas, but very specifically, they have their commitment to us to support our operations management teams in implementing the disability inclusion common services in the operations as part of the BOS of the country. So you have the expert group. When you organize your operations management teams, or when you plan to start implementation of the disability inclusion common services at the country level, if you feel that you need extra support, you need an expert support in here, you can engage with us, and we'll connect you with one of these colleagues to support the implementation of the disability inclusion common services in your country. The next important point here is, colleagues, just previous slides, please, is to ensure that the implementation of the services are done on priority basis, and you could sequence them in an appropriate manner. So I always gave examples of myself trying to make an office accessible when I was working in the field, where I started from making a restroom accessible. That's a good step. I'm still proud on what I did. But I realized that once the work was completed, I realized that actually we don't have a ramp to access the office. So a person with disability, with physical disability, might have not been able to access our office in the very first hand before they could utilize an accessible restroom. So prioritization of the common services and the sequencing of which one to be implemented or all to be implemented at the same time is really, really necessary and important. The same applies, let's say, as I mentioned, for reasonable accommodation for our staff. So you need to make sure that you sequence your implementation plan in the BOS in a way that by the time that your office is accessible, or you have colleagues joining you with disabilities, they have the right reasonable accommodation, and they have all the necessary reasonable accommodation as mentioned. Next slide, please. So in the platform, colleagues, as we have been mentioning, the high impact common services are tagged as recommended services. So these are applicable to the disability and inclusion common services as well. These common services have a practice note attached to it, where you can read slightly detailed information about what is the physical accessibility or digital accessibility or inclusive HR. And these practice notes are developed based in collaboration with experts from the system, from the UN system, as well as we have acquired quite a lot of support from colleagues from outside of the system as well, just to make sure that it's a well-thought practice notes to help you in terms of sequencing of the services that you need to implement at the country level, as well as its priority and its importance and its inclusiveness. We will have a dedicated webinars, as I mentioned, via a dedicated expert team where necessary for your OMTs in case if you feel it's needed, or for your UNCTs in case if it's needed, for any particular topic within the range of the common services introduced in this topic. Next slide, please. And the very last slide, please, colleagues, before we move on to the Q&A session, is that if you have already developed your BOS, if your BOS has been completed at the moment, you will, and you have not included the disability inclusion common services, you can start working toward inclusion of the disability inclusive common services in the BOS review. But if your BOS is still in development process, we highly recommend that you include all the necessary common services that are possible to be implemented during the cycle of your BOS in your BOS now. These are high impact common services. They have high return on quality of the service, as well as on the social impact and inclusiveness of your office. So that's a highly recommended common service for you to consider in your discussions for before you finalize your BOS. So let me stop here, colleagues, and then open the floor for questions and answers. I know there has been a lot of questions coming up in the chat, and colleagues are responding to some of them. So let me hand over the floor to Luis Diago, who is our lead consultant in the DCO supporting this process, to take you through the questions and answers and open the floor for colleagues to raise their questions to the experts directly. Over to you, Diego. Diego, you're still mute. I'm not sure if you started talking yet.
Hi, Xavier. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, that's
great. Thank you. And thank you, Gopal, for the presentation. A lot of the questions have been addressed. I think in the chat, feel free to raise your hand if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question. But there was a question at the beginning that I'd like to address to Gopal, asking about what defines a disability and just talking generally about what it means to be a person with a disability.
Thank you, Luis Diego. So colleagues, when you think about disability, if you think about persons with disabilities, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, according to the CRPD, that's what the short form of the convention, it says persons with disabilities include those who have physical, sensory, or an intellectual or mental impairment, which in the interaction with the barriers in the environment hinder the participation of that person on an equal basis with others in the society. So that's how it defines outlines persons with disabilities. Now there are two important things. One is that persons with disability, when you talk about disability, it's an interaction between the impairment and the environment. And when we say the environment, it's the barriers in the environment or the enablers. So the barriers in the environment may be a physical barrier in terms of attitudes, in terms of policies, in terms of regressive policies or norms or procedures and so on. So it is extremely important to understand that persons with disabilities are not only defined by their impairment, but by the interaction between the impairment and the barriers that exist in the society. That's number one. And number two is that persons with disabilities are first and foremost people, right? So, and people, as we know, have different identities, different characteristics, attributes in terms of gender, in terms of race, ethnicity, in terms of where they live. So these aspects also, to a great extent, determine to what extent a person with disability is included or excluded. To what it determines the extent of discrimination and exclusion, and on the other hand, the inclusion that that person experiences. So this is how the convention defines or outlines persons with disabilities. I also saw a question on attitudes that certain staff members are may have some hesitation on interacting with persons with disabilities, and for sure. And but also we see that as a person with disability myself, I have seen working within the UN that a lot, staff are often the biggest supporters, the biggest champions, as we are seeing in this webinar itself. And there are also staff members who unknowingly, they may have a hesitation, they unknowingly are not including persons with disabilities to the extent that they can. But this is it is always possible to overcome that by through reading, through attending webinars of this sort, and through interaction with persons with disabilities. But yes, I totally, that point is well noted. I'll stop there. Luis Diego, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Gopal. There were also many questions about the specific and technical specifications of implementing the physical accessibility services, and we mentioned for the people that will be watching the recording, practice notes will be released shortly. They're being revised in final edits with the technical cards and all this information. There was another question about the disability inclusion needs additional service. It also needs accommodation considerations and flexible working modalities. Where are these being considered, which refers, I think, to reasonable accommodation. If you, Gopal and Lars, if you want to chime in as well.
Lars, would you like me to go first?
You go first, Gopal, that's fine.
Yeah, no, thank you. And these are extremely important issues. And Lars will tell you about DCO, but we also know that many entities. We know like 20 odd entities are currently framing their policies and upgrading the policies and procedures to make reasonable accommodation available to persons with disabilities. Right from the recruitment stage and onboarding, as well as day-to-day work. And of course, it requires services. If you see, accessibility and reasonable accommodation go hand in hand. And as we are improving accessibility of our premises, of our digital services and products, reasonable accommodation is also a provisioning of reasonable accommodation is also imperative. And flexible working arrangements and all, it's of course they're already a part of the offering that of our HR. And for persons with disabilities, again, that's very extremely important. And we know of multiple instances where they are being considered. I'll stop there.
Colleagues, if you would allow me, Diego, to make a quick point here. There is a multitude of arrangements in place across the UN, right? And that's a good thing, but at the same time also a bit of a challenge, because it's very hard to find, okay, where do I go to find a particular item? You still have the agencies having their own policies set in place. That's supplemented now by more and more joint initiatives, including the ones we're talking about today. But I want to highlight one point that came up in the chat earlier. It is very important when you roll out, for example, when we're monitoring the BOSes now, we see a very heavy intake of the physical accessibility piece, which of course is very important, as well as the recruitment and the HR pieces. But keep in mind that these things kind of go hand in hand. For example, if you work on recruitment and promote recruitment, particularly at the G level for people living with a disability, you need to ensure you got your web access in place to that people who have needs actually can use the tools that the UN has at their disposal. At the same time, clearly you need to have your physical alteration in place. So these things, it is highly recommended you move on the 3 areas. Now, if you're building already, and I'm not just talking ramps, I mean, reasonable accommodation is one. It is indeed the all kinds of facilities within the building that they're accessible, but it's also that if a person needs access to knowledge and our tools online, you're going to need the web access tools. So moving just on one when you don't have the other pieces in place is something to be approached with very great care. It's better to move in all 3 areas. Now, the UN traditionally, web accessibility, I've been in this field for a while, is not something people of countries have naturally taken up. So it is very much recommended to look at in the practice note also, for example, for web accessibility, which you might not know that well. And I, for one, I also had to read up on it to ensure that those services get pushed together with the other 2. And with regards to cost, in many cases, the costs are not that high. Web accessibility is not a high level cost. Physical accessibility is a bit higher. We're working on resource mobilization for that. But please look at it as a package. Don't just move on one because that's the one you know, because we're going to bound to end up in a situation where you have certain things in place and others are not, and still. The people living with a disability are not fully empowered, so yeah, that might end up in very strange situations. So a very strong recommendation to look at this as a package, including web accessibility, which may be less well known. Back to you, Diego.
Thank you, Lars. And also to note that this is going to be an ongoing process. Part of this process is also creating a resource sharing platform and a network collaboration with partners that will help you implement this at your country level. So this is just the beginning, and I'm sure there's going to be many questions and many iterations of not only the practice notes, but the services. Along with this, Lars, there was another question that said, following conducting inclusive and accessibility audits, you have noted a need for significant costs to be compliant. Is there a budget to support the structural adjustments on our buildings? I'm aware that you already answered that, but if you can kind of touch on that again.
Yeah, colleagues, well, and indeed, I just highlighted it. I mean, certain elements of the disability packages, they do require investments, capital investment in particular. It tends to be concentrated in the physical accessibility area. We are working with different partners, both internally in the UN as well with external partners to raise capital for this. That is ongoing. We didn't want to wait with the webinars because the bosses are being designed now. So we are working to support you in this one. I do want to highlight that to use an example that is very often raised, like the ever-present ramps, for example, because that's what people get in mind when they talk about accessibility. Yeah, we need to build ramps. It doesn't always mean that you need to have like a reconstruction of your building. There are mobile ramps which are much lower cost that can actually be moved across the space. So for now, we don't have the funds in place yet, but again, we're working on it. But that doesn't mean that these whole services cannot be picked up. The HR services are very low cost, as Zamir presented. That's mainly staff time. Web accessibility is not an expensive package. And on physical, definitely look at the lower cost alternatives, which can be just as effective. But we will soon update you. We're working on the efficiency fund with different donors as well as foundations, UN internal capital. But yeah, we're working on many things at the same time. So we first had to get these practice notes out to you. So we will continue to work on that, and we will keep you updated on this. Back to you, Diego.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Lars. There are many questions. I'll touch upon as many as we can. And remember, you can go ahead and raise your hand if you want to unmute and also ask a question directly. There were a couple of questions on training of staff on disability inclusion, and some resources were shared. But if you want to kind of share a little bit on that, Gopal, of some of the resources available for staff to train on disability inclusion.
Thank you, Luis Diego. Yes, colleagues, there is a webinar which is currently available. It is a very good one. And I mean, when I say good one, colleagues have told us that they really found it was useful. It is called Disability Inclusion 101, Basic Concepts and Approaches. A link has been shared and you can go through it. And the UNSDG portal has several other resources. And we are all currently Office of Human Resources is currently working on a training package, online training module on disability inclusion. And there are several others in the making which will be rolled out later this year. So currently we have the Disability Inclusion 101 webinar, and we would really recommend that colleagues have a look if you can, whenever you have time. And there was also one question, I'm hearing it on the chat with my screen reader, that there was a couple of colleagues who raised on about any staff member who acquires an impairment because as a person with disabilities after being recruited. For sure, if you see all these initiatives, staff members, existing staff members who have a disability or have acquired a disability in course of one's work in the UN are all covered under the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, because it covers all persons with disabilities. And many of these services, you know, in terms of reasonable accommodation, in terms of accessibility, both physical accessibility, web accessibility, in terms of training, all are applicable to and will benefit staff members with disabilities, or staff have picked up a disability, or even I will go as far as to say staff members who have or staff members who have dependents with disabilities. You know, we know of a lot of staff members who have dependents with disabilities. Yes, so it's quite a broad issue, and the strategy does cover. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gopal. There was also another question asking whether this strategy was going to involve influencers and other collaborations in order to gain more momentum. Lars, would you like to address that?
Sure. Apart from what you saw today, we're working on an expanded outreach and communication strategy for disabilities, which obviously will include champions, influencers, as you would call it. It includes also getting the message out exactly what the needs are, what the experiences are, what is being done, not just in the UN, but also beyond the UN in the host country and society. So we're mobilizing. I'm pretty sure, Gopal, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have champions appointed within the UN. I saw a question whether we have ambassadors. I don't know that specifically, but I'm fairly sure we have champions appointed. But once we start working on the communication outreach, the broader ones, which we hope to do together with partners, not just UN, but speaking to a much broader audience, using each other's platforms to get that outreach, we will start using influencers and well-known champions to get the messages out. But Gopal, maybe you have some specific information. Do we have appointed champions at this stage already, or ambassadors type of?
So, for example, we do not have a specific ambassador on disability inclusion, but you are right, Lars. Several existing goodwill ambassadors, high-level ambassadors. Several of them specifically champion disability inclusion. For example, Stevie Wonder, he's a messenger of peace, but in the past we have had Stevie Wonder championing disability inclusion, and several high-profile, Katy Perry and others champion disability inclusion. And both us and entities use their part to get messages across. And within the SDG champions, the group that Deputy Secretary General and the Secretary General interacts with very closely. There is Eddie Ndapu, who specifically champions, is a SDG champion on disability inclusion, and we are trying every day to build that and make that even stronger. So currently, within the SDG champions, there is a person, and within the overall goodwill ambassadors, messengers of peace, there is no one specific who is addressing disability inclusion specifically or only disability inclusion, but there are several of them who are really championing the issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Gopal and Lars. And I think this opens the floor to many other suggestions to gain more momentum, whether it's locally or internationally, and to keep this initiative as a live document, working document. There is another question asking about, it was a comment that there were sub-working groups or disability within the OMT and the PMT to ensure mainstreaming. I don't know, Zamir, if you also want to comment on this or things that the OMTs, local OMTs can do to help roll out these services. We're almost coming to an end. We have about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Diego. Colleagues, just so you know, there is a network of disability and disability inclusion focal points throughout the world in the UN system that can be basically your support at the country level. Mainly, the services that are identified in the BOS are picked up by HR working group in OMT, by admin working group, as well as ICT working group. But because they are not expert in the area of the disability inclusion, we have this very hardcore team at the corporate level, Gopal, Georgia, Amy, Brianna, and they are supported with a great number of colleagues and experts from the UN system that can be tapped to, and they can support you basically in terms of identifying the disability inclusion needs for your office and helping you through implementation of those. So apart from possible focal points at the country level, you have this global and regional support structure in place that can help you in this process. But the start of the action is with you, with the operations management teams and the working groups of the operations management teams to map and identify the gaps in disability inclusion in the operations of the UN, and then start basically engagement with the experts and identifying the needs for implementation. So I know we have 3 last minutes to go before we conclude the session. I would like to open the floor to our experts that are basically working in the background of this webinar today. Brianna, Georgia, Amy, that haven't spoken, just to see if they have any last points before I hand over the floor to Lars to conclude the webinar. And in the meantime, in the chat box, colleagues, those of you that might have access to the chat today, Diego is going to share a poll just to get a glance of how useful these webinars are. And if you could please click on that one question survey or poll and respond to that, that would be great as well. So I see Brianna has raised her hand. So I'm handing the floor to Brianna, and then if Amy and Georgia has anything else to add, and then we'll move with conclusion with Lars. Over to you, Brianna.
Thanks very much, Samir, and thanks to all the colleagues for the engagement and the really interesting comments and suggestions in the chat. So just to sort of reiterate that all country teams completed the UN Disability Inclusion Accountability Scorecard late last year, and we have been reviewing and validating the responses that were provided, and we'll hope to draw from that also some good experiences that we can share back with country teams. So perhaps as a first initiative, we'll look at the work around operations and see if we can pull together some good practices to share with you. We shared in the chat the link to the site on the UNSDG knowledge platform, and I encourage all of the colleagues here to access that and see what resources are there. There are webinars, all the information about the disability inclusion strategy, links to trainings, many other resources and videos and the like that you can also use in engagements with OMTs and across the UN country teams. And just to sort of reinforce the point that, I mean, it's fantastic that these specific services are being scaled through the BOS. As Lars mentioned, I think this is a way to really get significant impact and economies of scale. And these are complemented then by the range of other areas of work that are highlighted in the scorecard across programming and other areas as well. So please also note that, what the OMTs are doing on operations will very much, kind of complement and be complemented by other initiatives across the cooperation framework and coordination mechanisms in the country team, etc. So don't feel that you're on your own on this. Every UN country team should have a disability inclusion focal point. So please, if you're not aware of who that is, kind of reach out to your RC and try to identify who that is. If your country team doesn't yet have one, then the RC and UNCT should be nominating one and letting us know. And they can also access then the network and help to find resources and information as you need it. And as Samir said, we're all here to support if you have any questions along the way. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Brianna. Any other points to be shared by our colleagues? Amy, Georgia? Okay, so let me hand over the floor to Lars for a closing of this webinar then.
Thank you, Samir. So, colleagues, this concludes the, what is it? I think the third webinar on specific BOS services. I think the general message is that there's a misconception about business operations and efficiency, right? That it's all about money. That it has to reduce cost, and that cost gets over highlighted. And we should not forget that business operations can have a very direct social impact. If you talk about leaving no one behind, we play a role in that particular dialogue, and also by the means and instruments we have at our disposal as operations staff. So that's very important. Disabilities of people living with a disability is a very significant stakeholder group, as Gopal highlighted. The numbers are very high, so it warrants attention also on the operations side. And we hope by providing you these standardized packages and the ideas exchanged here, that you push these forward under your BOS. Again, I want to stress, like, look at it as a package. Don't move on one without actually addressing the others. It's great that you have premises accessible to people living with a disability, or the tools for people with various disabilities to engage productively. But if you don't recruit them, for example, that is also not going to be very helpful, and vice versa. So they become as a package. So please look also at the web accessibility and the HR tools. I think at the end of the day, it is important that the UN walks the talk and champions this cause. I mean, we have so many high-level visitors with significant decision power entering our buildings, engaging with the UN, and the UN making the statement that people living with disabilities are as productive and as value-adding as any other member of society is a very powerful message. And for those of you who actually read the BOS guidance, it talks about links to program, right? How BOS engages with program, where the two interact and support each other. Based on the services, for example, you saw the network mapping that we have in the operational services, the CSOs, the NGOs, the suggestions made to engage broader society champions for this cause. These things can easily be expanded by engaging, for example, government and private sector to duplicate our efforts. So an operational service in that sense becomes a programmatic service with an outreach at the full host country. So this is just the first step, but it is important that our operations staff and our own teams communicate to program staff, like, listen, this is what we're doing. We have mapped all these different civil society organizations, NGOs, different stakeholders, and that program can build upon what we've done by replicating it with different stakeholders. So very slowly we start scaling the service beyond just us, but we walk the talk. We are championing this cause. So that is very important. Also, based on the feedback in the chat, listen, this is a start. This is not a full package with which we're going to solve this particular issue. It's a start where we start first address certain issues, and we will expand and build from there. There's many more disabilities that actually need attention. Intellectual disabilities and different types of mental disabilities are also there, but we got to start somewhere. And physical and sensory disabilities are a good start. So we will, over time, we will build this out. You are not restricted only to these services. Like always, you can add services you feel at a country level. Like, listen, I think this is important. This is what we need to do. Feel free to do so and reach out to us. So we will help you on an ad hoc basis, both Brianna's team in DCO as well as my team. So that's a very key message. One last thing I wanted to stress before we close is the behavioral components. At the end of the day, a lot of the business operations stuff is change, right? It's behavioral change. We do things differently than we did them before. I think the training and awareness are very key components in this. I don't have the time to go in detail, but there's so many ways that due to ignorance, and not intentional, but due to ignorance, you're actually perpetrating or extending the negative impact on a particular community, including people living with a disability. And people need to be aware how to handle that and how to better deal with that, so that inclusiveness is actually reached. And it is so easy to actually contribute to it, even if you don't mean to. So I think the awareness pieces at local level, we will support you at global level with larger scale awareness and outreach, but do not forget about that one. It is also about educating a host country and people in a broader communities. So with that, if you haven't voted, please give your vote on how useful you find the webinar. This is a rolling webinar, so throughout the year and next year we will do many more of these. And we want to make sure, because there's quite a lot of them, that these are useful to you. If you feel that these are not useful, then clearly there's no point in doing them. But so your feedback helps us make it better. And in the end, you help yourself with that as well. Thank you very much for taking your time. Diego and Zamir, well done. Credit to you, Gopal, Brianna, Amy. It's great working together on this one. And let's start lifting this one. We can really make a difference here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Lars. And thank you to all the people involved also in the background, Paul Lee, also from Kessler Foundation, and so many other partners that we can't mention here, but we'll continue with the collaborations for sure. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.